series on terrorism and homeland security that the Woodrow Wilson Center co-sponsors with Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies and the U.S. Army's Dwight D. Eisenhower National Security Series. Delighted that the manager of that program, Major John Pryor, is with us today. Before turning the floor over to the co-chair of this series, Professor Bruce Hoffman of Georgetown University, let me first express gratitude to the Army for their support of this series, and also to say that an internal co-sponsor of this meeting is within the Wilson Center is our Middle East program, which is directed by Haleh Esfandiari. We're grateful for their co-sponsorship of this meeting as well. I also wanted to bring to your attention a meeting that will take place on Thursday, November 2nd. It's not part of this series, but it's another meeting at the Wilson Center that may be of interest to some of those here today. November 2nd from 4 to 6 p.m., the Center is sponsoring a program that will feature the new book by Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the Washington correspondent of The New Yorker. There was a book reviewed this last weekend in major newspapers, just out. It's entitled Prisoners. Subtitle is A Muslim and a Jew Across the Middle East Divide. It's been much anticipated and well reviewed already. We're delighted that Jeff Goldberg will be able to be here Thursday at 4, and we have two superb commentators for that session. David Brooks, the columnist of the New York Times, is coming, as well as Professor Walter Reich of George Washington University. So for those, it's an open public event up in our auditorium. For those interested and available to come, please note the time, Thursday, November 2nd, 4 to 6 p.m. Today, let me turn the floor over to Bruce, who will introduce our speaker in today's topic. Our speaker is Steve Simon, and Bruce will introduce him. But Steve's spoken here a number of occasions. It's always a pleasure to have him back here, and the topic could not be more topical and timely.
Well, thank you very much, Robin. Let me also extend a very warm welcome to you today. Steve is another one in a long line of distinguished speakers we've had that really needs no introduction. He's currently a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. Prior to that, he was a colleague of mine at the RAND Corporation. Before that, he was deputy director of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and prior to that, he spent over 5 years in the White House on the National Security Council as director of global issues, and then as senior director of transnational threats, and that succeeded a 15-year-long career in the Foreign Service and at the State Department. But I think what people know less about Steve, even though his books co-authored with Dan Benjamin, The Age of Sacred Terror, which of course won the most prestigious award given by the Council of Foreign Relations, and his more recent book, Final Attack, will have made Steve a very renowned and frequent contributor on a variety of television shows, media shows, and conferences. But I think what most people don't know about him is his rich academic background that he brings to the study of this issue. He has a master's degrees in theology as well as public administration, respectively from Harvard and from Princeton, and his first degree from Columbia was a joint BA in Classics and Near Eastern Languages. So not only does he have the intellectual acumen and the analytical abilities, but also the linguistic capabilities needed to investigate the issues of the day with prescience and authority. And with that, he will today discuss why is the jihad so durable. Steve, welcome and thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that generous introduction, Bruce. My point today, I'm going to give a ponderous and pedantic presentation, believe me, but I just thought I'd introduce it in a kind of preambular way with a single point, namely that the jihad is, in a sense, overdetermined. There are many contributing causes to this baleful phenomenon, and these are interlocking causes, and as such, even if Muslims themselves, wherever they might be, in whatever situation they find themselves, or the United States and its allies were able to deal with one or another of these contributing causes. Overall, the causes are so numerous, complex, and rooted. It's difficult to see how the actions of individuals or states at this point, certainly in the near future, would be able to counter the jihad or cause it to just go away. Now, I'm going to concentrate in this presentation on 7 of these conditions, but in fact, I have a somewhat longer list. If you would like to stay overnight, but let me list these conditions and then discuss the details a little bit before we go into our discussion segment of today's session. The first of these contributing conditions is the deep roots of the revival movement in which the jihad is embedded. The second is a connection between contemporary Salafism, which is a certain reading of Islam that I'll discuss in a second. In fact, one might call it a kind of hard Islam, and jihadism. The third is the changing nature of clerical authority within the Islamic world. The fourth would be the globalization of Muslim identity. The fifth would be the evolution of anti-Americanism among Muslims in particular, although it's growing more broadly. Then there are the linkages between jihadism and persisting patterns of social organization, particularly in the Arab world, but also in diaspora communities which carried over from countries of origin certain patterns of organization. And finally, the continuing debate over the killing of civilians in defense of Muslim interests. Now, there are other hugely important factors that I'm prepared to discuss and that I don't mean to slight, actually, in this presentation, and they have to do with demographics and socioeconomic determinants relating to this global movement, as well as the role of democratization, the precise impact of the new media on Muslim opinion, and other significant drivers of militancy. So I'm essentially cherry-picking from an even bigger set of important factors. But a little about origins, just to put things into context and exemplify the very deep roots of this phenomenon. It can be traced back to a reform movement among Arabs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The intellectual leaders of this broad initiative were dismayed by the parlous state of affairs in the Arab world. The population was largely poor, educational and scientific achievements were few, and colonial administrations dominated government in those areas that an exhausted Ottoman Empire no longer held sway. The evident decline of a once great civilization demanded both an explanation and a strategy for renewal. Some prominent reformers, in Egypt and Syria in particular, but also, initially in Egypt and Syria, laid the blame for the decline on Muslims' estrangement from their roots. Now, a combination of centuries of clerical obfuscation, in the view of these commentators, on the one hand, and an infatuation with the West on the other, had cut Muslims off from these roots. So the sources of cultural vitality and confidence had been lost. They could be regained, however, through direct access to Scripture and inspiration offered by the actions and experiences of Muhammad and his followers at the very dawn of the Islamic era. Now, this will be striking a chord with some of you who think about contemporary trends in American Christianity. What would Jesus do is something one hears quite a bit. Well, the version in this other context is, what would Muhammad do? Now, the individuals, the generations to whom these reformers looked back were called the Salaf Salih, the righteous ancestors, hence the term Salafism, just to dispel whatever mystery there is around that tag, which we'll be using elsewhere in this discussion. In any case, fortified by renewed faith, in a strengthened faith, Muslims would have the confidence and autonomy to take what they needed from the Western inventory of scientific and technological advances to improve their material condition without sacrificing their sense of identity, which would be indispensable for independence from foreign powers, indispensable to the process of independence. Now, this brand of Salafism evolved significantly since it was first introduced. There are a number of figures who are very prominent in this transformation, as well as historical circumstances in which these interpreters of Salafism emerged. One was Sayyid Qutb, that many of you have probably heard of already. He was the Solzhenitsyn of the Islamist opposition in Egypt. He was executed by Nasser in 1966. He was an impassioned advocate of justice, and he came to see the West as fundamentally corrupt and antithetical to Islamic values. He argued that the two worlds were in fact irreconcilable. In his view, a reversion to the values of the Salaf, the righteous ancestors I referred to before, and a reliance on classic expressions of God's revelation would have to be accompanied by a rejection of the West. There were others who fit this mold and who formed a kind of chain of tradition or chain of transmission between medieval exponents of a kind of dualist view of the world and a kind of Kulturkampf, and Sayyid Qutb. These were very important individuals. If we can talk about them in greater detail, I won't belabor the point now, except to say that there was a chain of transmission. There was a reception history to these ideas that were very important. Now, this harder form of Salafism, this somewhat more rigid and limited set of ideas to which Salafism devolved since its initial proponents in the late 19th and early 20th centuries first put forward these ideas. This kind of new Salafism is a milieu in which jihadism thrives, and I'm emphasizing this because ideas are important. Ideas are very important, and the jihadist impulse, which is multivalent, has important roots in ideas, and these ideas are largely consistent with this kind of Salafist worldview. Now, I hasten to add that not all Salafists are jihadists. In fact, very few are. Most Salafists are pietistic. They focus on the reform of society through the reform of individual mores and patterns of behavior. Teaching and preaching is their thing. Now, there is another cohort among Salafists that are activists, but scarcely jihadists. They seek to influence politics through the offering of memoranda of advice or overt criticism of regime policies, if we're talking, say, about the Middle East, but also of government policies elsewhere, that is to say, in other regions where Muslims reside in large numbers. They are a privatized group, and they can be militant but not violent. Finally, there is a much smaller group, which we would talk about jihadists, which we would talk of as jihadists. And, for these individuals, preaching and teaching reform, which is the key theme of the activists among Salafists, these are simply insufficient. Violent resistance is the only response at this point that can meet the challenge to Muslim identity and well-being. Now, the thing about Salafism in this regard is that as a set of beliefs, it is very much focused on boundaries. Boundaries between us and them, boundaries between Muslim and non-Muslim, boundaries between good Muslim and bad Muslim, boundaries between men and women. And this preoccupation with boundaries is something that individuals find compelling on, in I guess in deep psychological terms, in periods when they feel challenged. And I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the writings of Emmanuel Sabbagh. He's a historian at Hebrew University. He's written a very influential article called Enclave Culture, in which he talks about the way in which this preoccupation with boundaries forms enclaves, which not only seek to keep outsiders out, but also seek to keep insiders in to prevent defection. And this lends this preoccupation with boundaries lends itself to a certain kind of security in insecure times. Lends itself to feelings of security in insecure times. So this is extremely important in my view. Now, Salafism seems to be burgeoning, in part because it's an uncomplicated set of doctrines, relatively speaking, and in part because it does have this emphasis on boundaries that people find very meaningful, but it also has an aura of authenticity which gives it added power and influence. And as long as this particular reading of Islam maintains its appeal, and in fact enjoys growing appeal, then the milieu in which jihadism is rooted, the ideational milieu, is going to continue to be problematic. Okay, clerical authority was another issue I raised. It's the breakdown in this authority that contributes to the easy elision of Salafism and jihadism. Clerical control over scriptural interpretation and, by extension, over the actions of the community began to erode long ago. This was hastened by Colonial Rule, a very interesting story indeed, and then intensified by the actions of Middle Eastern regimes who were seeking to justify or legitimize their rule through a kind of religious ideology for which they depended on the clerics for support. This in turn, of course, undercut the clerics' legitimacy at the popular level because they were seen as tools of a regime. So, as a result, there's no natural institutional break on this very hard reading of Islam that we've been discussing. Another factor is globalized identity. This is really crucial, especially when you think of events in Madrid or London or Denmark or Germany or Indonesia and so forth. In the 18th and 19th centuries, literacy, the spread of literacy, enabled the creation of national identities in Europe. Literacy was crucial for the development of modern Europe, and that is to say, national identities in modern Europe. And in the same way, the new media, beginning with audio cassettes and now with the internet, have been indispensable in forging a new kind of constructed community, or imagined community, as a famous sociologist, Ben Anderson, would have put it. And the evidence for this is striking, and I'll just give you one example. In Pew polling that was administered in 2003, large majorities in 8 of 9 Muslim survey groups completely agreed or somewhat agreed with the statement, "I feel more solidarity these days with Islamic people living around the world." This was the case for 80% or more of the respondents in Indonesia and Pakistan, while at least 70% of those surveyed in Lebanon, Nigeria, and Jordan agreed. And there were pluralities who agreed with this in Kuwait, Morocco, and the Palestinian Authority. So you're seeing this broad identification with a Muslim self, as it were, and that has good points and it has bad points. It has good points in as much as Muslims can share in a sense of accomplishment where they feel that there has been accomplishment, but it also means that they share in the trauma that are felt by Muslims in other places, even though they themselves might not be in a traumatic situation. Anti-Americanism, another big issue. It needs to be said, and I have 2 points on this score. The first is that bin Laden's long letter to the Americans, I don't know if anybody's has had a chance to read it, it's relatively recent, it's a good example of a grab bag approach to Muslim anti-American rhetoric, which for the most part doesn't have a distinctively Islamic content, which is one of the interesting things about it. A lot of it derives from the standard kind of Soviet or leftist critique of the United States that was broadcast extensively in the region, of course, since the Soviets began to seek influence in the region, but also from Nazi propaganda, actually. And there's an interesting story here, which I won't go into right now. But in any case, this kind of grab bag approach to anti-Americanism lashes the United States for everything from capitalist rapacity, neo-colonialist pretensions, propensity for violence, self-righteous hypocrisy, cultural depravity and licentiousness, degradation of women, all in addition, of course, to having the wrong religion. But the expansiveness, the internal logical consistency to some of these arguments and their interlocking nature means that it's this anti-American thing in ideational terms is very difficult to challenge. And we can chip away at it, and indeed we have in interesting ways, mostly by what we've done. And here the response to the tsunami on the part of the United States in 2004 was very interesting, because even though it didn't completely reverse extremely anti-American views in Indonesia, for a time it ameliorated them considerably. And there, the crucial element was that our aid was seen to be unconditional. And that was a very big thing in the way the aid was perceived. Now, another interesting piece of this story is in the form of Karen Hughes' assistant. She's the Undersecretary of the State Department for Public Diplomacy. Very good Arabic speaker, gave an influential interview, I guess it was on Al Jazeera, in which he said, look, the United States has made big mistakes in Iraq, and we've been stupid and arrogant. And he used just those words in Arabic. Very, very good reception, as far as we can tell thus far. Very, very good reception. And not, by good reception, I mean not sort of gloating reception, like, oh, you see, they admit it. But, oh, well, you know, they're not as arrogant as we thought, and they are in a tough situation. That's very significant. Now, you know, these negative images that I've been talking about, these anti-American themes, have been intensified, accelerated by a flood of imagery, and imagery is hugely important. This is intuitively obvious, but images of Muslims as victims and images of Muslims as vanquishers have exercised a huge influence. And on both scores, you know, the evidence from crime scenes, that is to say, where conspirators in terrorist attacks have been arrested, videotapes have been a feature of every hall, every law enforcement hall from these sites. I don't think that there's, well, maybe there are exceptions. I can't possibly know every case, but it's clear that these images have been very powerfully mobilizing, and Iraq, of course, has been a very important source of these images. On patterns of social organization, let's just say that in the Middle East, and to some extent in South Asia, for most people, if you want to get something done, it can't be done outside of the context of what scholars call a dense associational network. In other words, an informal network that helps you get things done. Because if you know, bribery is necessary to do a lot of things, the bureaucracies are rampant, it's just difficult to do anything. So therefore, you rely on informal networks of money changers, of fixers, of relatives who know people who know other people who can make things happen, whether it's getting your kid an education, or it's moving money overseas, or it's getting a license to do something. You need to have this kind of informal network that runs parallel to the state. Very important in understanding the durability of the jihad, because radicals or militants have this system on which they can piggyback. It's there, and it's very much a part of the way societies work. So, crucial factor. Okay, the last thing I'm going to mention has to do with the rules of war. There is a debate, and it's a very, I guess I would say, vigorous and flourishing debate among Salafis. I'm not talking about sort of moderate, so-called moderate Muslims but among Salafis themselves about legitimate forms of resistance, and particularly about the line between combatant and non-combatant. And the fact that there's a debate is a good thing. The fact that so much of the debate appears to favor a widening of the category of combatant is not such a good thing. Now, this debate can go in any number of directions, and the debate is made more complex by confusion within the Salafi community about whether it's permissible to kill Muslims in this process, let alone non-Muslims. So there are a number of issues that need to be worked out. But depending on how this debate plays out, we're going to have greater or lesser problems. And I'll close on this point by just saying that permissive juridical attitudes, I think, are important because they influence the attitudes of ordinary individuals about what's okay and what's not okay. Now, I just came back from Australia, and I spoke to the police officials who were responsible for breaking up what looked like a major conspiracy, two related networks in Melbourne and Sydney, a related network in two different cities. And the striking thing about this story is that the neighbors of the conspirators appeared to know what was going on, and they didn't say anything. Now, the crucial informant turned out, I think, to be the father-in-law of one of the conspirators. There was a family thing involved, but the fact is, their neighbors, who were Australian Muslims, felt that, well, maybe, these kids were doing something right, hence the importance of the debate over rules of war. I'll end there.
Great, thank you very much. Questions? Let's go first. So please identify yourself and your institutional affiliation. Where's the microphone coming?
My name is Camille Caesar. I'm a lawyer for the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Commerce Department. I had a question that I think relates to some of your initial remarks about the trend away from traditional religious formats toward these very participatory formats that lead people to be quite politically driven. I mean, this is obviously happening in Islam in a very aggressive manner, but we also see this happening in Christianity. People are abandoning, of course, in this country, mainstream Protestantism for Pentecostal and charismatic denominations, and this is happening globally as the Catholic Church and Anglican churches are in retrenchment against evangelical movements. So I'm just interested in your views on this generally. Thank you.
We can have group questions.
We can, if What is, I think that's, if there's another question in this general area, we can take it. But otherwise, why don't you go ahead? Are you on this topic as well? Yes.
Thanks. I'm Claire Young. I'm the Australian American Alliance Fulbright Scholar this year. I was wondering, when you're trying to affect the willingness of judicial ideas to limit people supporting jihadism, whether America might have particular advantages or handicaps being a more religious society itself than, say, Europe or Australia.
That's a good question. On the first question, there is a worldwide trend in the direction of greater traditionalism and a blurring of the line between private and public piety. And this is accompanied by increasing demands really across the board to see religious values incorporated in public policy. And this is true whether you're talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Palestine, or you're talking about the evangelical Protestant community in the United States. Now, the community is differentiated really between those who want to see religious values expressed and taken into account, and those in public policy decision making and legislation, and those who wish to see legislation subordinated to religious values. And you see this debate within American fundamentalist communities, as well as in the Muslim community. And there you have the dividing line, the seeds of the tension between the Salafis that I was talking about and, say, the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not an undifferentiated thing, but yes, it's a worldwide quest to see a greater role for religion in the development of the rules under which societies are governed. On the second question, it's kind of interesting because we are very conscious of the way in which we express ourselves in religious terms publicly, and indeed, when particularly provocative statements have been made in the United States by religious figures, including the president, who's viewed by many as a religious figure. And I don't mean that in a snarky or ironical way. These remarks do ricochet around the Muslim media with great velocity, and I'm particularly thinking about slurs against the Prophet Muhammad and so forth. And they have an effect, but it's an adverse effect. The other peculiar thing, though, is that to the extent polling has been done on this, and there has not actually been a lot, there's been a huge amount of polling, but on this particular question, that is to say, perceptions of American religiosity or lack thereof, I know of just actually one poll that I think it was sponsored by the BBC, and it was conducted by Mustafa Hamarna in Amman in Jordan. And it seemed to show that actually the prevailing view of America was as a secular society, not a religious society. So, the perceptions of America on this score seem to be somewhat in flux. That doesn't mean, when I say secular, that it's perceived as being somehow pro-Islam or indifferent to Islam. It's still seen as being anti-Islam. But the jury's out.
Yeah, Gordon.
Thanks. Gordon Adams, fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Steve, there's a long list of things that obviously play a very important role in directing or influencing this trend of jihadism. There's one that is at least popularly discussed, which I'd like you to comment on, that you didn't bring up much except sort of slightly at the edge. That is sometimes portrayed here as a conflict or an argument between those who think that this is motivated by a rejection of Westernism, American values, Western tradition, secularism, if you will, democracy, our freedoms, our liberties, etc. And another trend that argues that some of this stems out of policy, or to put the finest point on it, Michael Scheuer's argument that it's the policy, stupid. It's not about the values. It's not about the religion. It's not about the society. It's about the policy. As a subset of that, Bob Pape has done some work on the uses of suicidal terrorism, which is not just Islamic in his research. It's a whole series of cases, some of which are Islamic in origin and some of which are not, which suggests that the one unifying condition of all of these responses to use the suicidal terrorist impulse and to act on it is a resistance to the presence of non-indigenous military force in your country or in your region or in your town or whatever it happens to be. And that he found as a consistent result of all of his studies of the cases of suicidal terrorism. I'm not asking you here to comment on the correctness or the incorrectness of the policy per se. I'm really saying, where would you situate that as a motivating element in jihadism, along with the obviously very thorough and detailed sources and origins that you have been talking about? That is to say, a perception that there is a policy reason for this kind of resistance, and as Pape would say, a kind of powerlessness for which the suicidal impulse in the end is the only option available.
On the policy versus values debate, people aren't stupid. They infer values from policy. So, I don't see the dichotomy between policy and values that, others might see. Although I understand, the sources of the debate. When Muslims look at things that we do in Iraq, now I'm not saying that they infer the values correctly from what they see, but nevertheless they infer the values. So when they see things that happen at Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, or the pictures of that Marine shooting the prone figures on the floor in some house in Iraq, which has been distributed quite widely, or they read about the Haditha massacre and so forth, they infer from this that, what Bin Laden and many others have said is true of American values, namely that they are, Americans value predation and are greedy and respond with violence to every provocation, all that sort of thing. It's kind of a seamless view. There was an interesting RAND study that was produced a couple of years ago on information operations, and the authors of the paper looked at sort of the academic literature on marketing, which had come to the astonishing conclusion that if a marketer's claims about a product were seen as inconsistent with the performance of the product, then consumers were skeptical, about the brand and the marketer and so forth. I think this does have some relevance for the way in which the U.S. is viewed. Now, the whole thing about Islamic fascism is kind of interesting because, I teach now. a little bit, once a week, to graduate students, and I felt that it was incumbent upon me to learn something about fascism when I teach Middle Eastern politics. I thought it was very important to do this. So I read Mussolini's 1932, What is Fascism? And I'll tell you something, it didn't fit bin Laden very well, or Islamism. I could think of another player in this drama that it fit exceedingly well, especially in the importance given to the dramatic deed that overturns history and renders history irrelevant. I could sort of see some parallels there, but not a lot of strong parallels between Islamism and fascism. And on the hating freedom, I'm gonna.
Don't go there.
No. I have to share with you one of my favorite bin Laden lines. This is like they change periodically, but he said, "Excuse me, we hate freedom? No, we love freedom, and it's those of us who are free who are killing you. The ones who are not free, you can tell are not free because they're not killing you." And I expect that take has somewhat more resonance in the communities that we're talking about than others. And as far as Bob Pape's analysis is concerned, I just heard him speak again on this at a DHS conference, and I think he underplays the religious component in this. And one of the peculiar things about his presentation was that he showed a videotape of Yehya Gadan, who was an American convert, a Californian Jew, who became an Islamist, and in this videotape he's urging Americans to attack their government because of atrocities that are being done by the United States in Afghanistan. And he interpreted that as, in this kind of nationalist way, stripped of the religious piece, and frankly, I was unconvinced, since the implicit agenda. The reason Muslims were supposed to be concerned about what was going on in Afghanistan was that Muslims were being, oppressed.
Yes, the woman in the against the wall.
Thank you. I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a clinical and political psychologist, also starting an institute here, and also interested in human development. And just to back up what Gordon said, I agree it's not that they hate our freedoms, but they hate being occupied. And I have Pape's book here, which I consider to be hard social science about that. But my question relates to that, but it's also specifically, I was very interested in your comments about the preoccupation with boundaries. And in terms of human development, say in normal development, there's a differentiation of self and other. With pathology, it's more like splitting, and there's splitting and projection, and when there's trauma. And then you get this, then our policies and our actions create what I call self-fulfilling paranoia. And people become more emotional, primitive, and I guess whatever religious issues are going there become more religious and more inflamed. I mean, I guess the other example is the Tamil Tigers, who are secular. So religion is not a requirement for this. There's also like the law of opposites, or we create what we resist, or being short-term focused. So is there any awareness, or people addressing policy in terms of how certain actions that we have feed right into their fears? And there's also envy, humiliation, fear. People are more dangerous when they're afraid and more violent when they're humiliated. And we could, I think, drastically reduce violence and terrorism if we had very different kinds of tension-reducing policies, which is sort of very far from our consciousness. So I'd like to know what you think about that.
Well, I think at least on the margins, there are things the United States could do. I alluded to some of them a couple of minutes ago in talking about Indonesia, and there's somewhat different rhetoric that came out of a relative, a kind of a mid-level State Department official that nevertheless had some impact because of the medium in which his views were expressed and the language in which they were expressed. So, there certainly are things we could do. There are other things that we haven't done that are probably within the realm of possibility, although in the very hard-to-do category, which would be, for example, to show a greater regard for the plight of Palestinians and so forth, and perhaps a bit more consistency in our rhetoric around democratization, although I think that we've resolved that problem by just dropping the rhetoric on democratization. Probably the sensible thing to do under the circumstances. But other than that, probably there isn't all that much. There was a kind of a bit of a tempest in a teapot, you'll recall, a few weeks ago over the national intelligence estimate on global terrorism that came out. And the big thing was that it had said that Iraq was kind of a contributor to some of the growth in jihadism. Well, the original draft of this NIE, as I understand it, when it went forward, focused a lot on these more kind of subjective contributors to the spread of jihadism, and the reception, the political reception to that draft, certainly at the White House, was very negative. Because it just wasn't what the consumers felt was relevant, and I think to some extent that is probably still true, although I don't know for sure.
Can I just abuse the chair's position for a second and make 2 points? One, this isn't going to debate about PAPE, but I think it's an argument for why terrorism scholars should study this, and why when others come with under-the-depth in terrorism sometimes get it wrong, because the Tamil Tigers, it's true, are a nationalist separatist group, but they have far more in common with Om Shinrikyo, for example, or with other Islamic groups. And Vellapillai Prabhakaran, the leader and founder, has much more in common, let's say, with Soko Asahara than he does with Jerry Adams in the IRA. So may not be a religious group, but almost its entire operation is very much cult-like and determines the, I think, less to do with occupation. But I don't want to get into debate, but I would call your attention to the journal that I happen to edit, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. The lead article of the December issue is, I think, the most profound critique of Professor Pape's work. It's the lead article written by Asaf Moghadam. It's worth reading. I think it's a very formidable challenge. But in any event, Alex Weissman.
Thank you. I'm Alex Ritzman from the European Foundation for Democracy. And I have a follow-up on that, what we are talking about right now. So the key question is, what makes those people hate us so much that they want to kill us? Is it what we do or what we are? And it sounds quite, good. That is probably what we do. But I wonder what would happen if the US troops and the coalition forces would draw back and leave the Arabic Peninsula totally alone. The US would stop their support for Israel. We just leave them alone. What would they do? Would they become gardeners? What would those martyr brigades, Al-Qaeda, and other groups do? And I think what we haven't addressed is the pursuit of a caliphate. It's not just fighting people that occupy them, I guess, but it's also they want to install a new kind of government there. So the key question is, where's the evidence for the thesis that it's what we do and not that it's what we are?
Well, just to recap something that I said, but I was probably unclear in my response to Gordon Adams' question, is that the line between who we are and what we do is, to some extent, illusory. I mean, we can project a line of that kind, but the observer on the outside doesn't necessarily see it. terribly sorry. Just kill this.
Put your phones on vibrator or stun, please.
I don't know how to do that. So I'm not sure the line is there. Your broader question about, okay, so suppose the U.S. met their demands, then what? Well, as a practical matter, the U.S. can't, because we're a global power with global interests, and that's just not going to happen. And that's one of the reasons that the Jihad has got the long legs that it has. This is not. Even if the United States had, to use an old-fashioned legal term, a duty to withdraw, in the face of violence, it's not clear that as a practical matter, that's possible. I would say, though, just to spur discussion, get people to throw a lot of plastic bottles at me, that if the U.S. did all that, I think that the jihadists would be cool with us. I think that that would make them happy, and that would be that. Europeans, however, wouldn't get away so easily, and we haven't talked about that brewing problem. But the Europeans would still be seen as evil hegemonists because of the way in which they're perceived to be treating Muslims within their own boundaries. But I think for the U.S. it would be okay. Finally, let me just note for the record that there isn't a whole lot of agreement on the caliphate issue. You do have, some groups who think that the establishment of a caliphate is, an important kind of policy objective. And you have others who say, well, maybe whenever. But we have other dumplings to boil in the meantime.
Well,
Steve, I just wanted to pursue in one of the elements of your argument. You talked about the debate within the jihadist movement on the distinction between civilians and combatants, and pursuing that. I mean, the issue of mass casualty attack, not just attacking civilians, but really trying to kill them in large numbers. And one argument that's made is probably there's no basis for in terms of evidence. It may be just that this is sort of an opaque system we can't look into very easily in terms of what bin Laden and Al Qaeda is up to. Some have said that the reason there hasn't been a big attack in America, is that 9/11 set the bar so high that they're waiting to try to replicate it, and something of that magnitude, a lesser attack wouldn't suffice. Just talk about that, and in the context of that, I mean, we outside of that world, read about some imam in Saudi Arabia that no one's ever heard of, who doesn't seem to have any standing. Issues of fatwa saying that it's okay to use nuclear weapons against infidels or something. I mean, it's sort of different than very top-down religions like Catholicism, where there's a pope who will make those kinds of judgments. So just talk about the issue of mass casualty versus small-scale attacks in the context of this kind of the debate within Islam.
Well, Muslim jurisprudence on relating to just wars isn't setting aside what's legitimate as a cause of war and what isn't. And by that I just mean that in the post-Westphalian post-Westphalian system, religious issues are not supposed to be legitimate causes of war, and in Muslim jurisprudence, religion, arguably in some traditions, is the only legitimate cause for war. But intra-war rules, resemble the Augustinian tradition, and there is the principle of proportional response. And from the jihadist point of view, a proportional response is one that's truly massive, because the damage that has been inflicted on Muslims by the United States and its allies has been quite massive. Now, their counting rules may differ from ours, but already before the current war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the militants were looking at sanctions, multilateral sanctions that had been imposed on Iraq, and said that, well, these sanctions have killed 1 million children, or more than 1 million children. The numbers, vary. Well, if you live in a world where proportional response is legitimate, then the legitimate response is massive indeed. Now, the numbers that are being put out about casualties in Iraq and other places are also quite big. So just by the law of proportional response, a massive attack would be okay.
Thank you. My name is Shelley Weinstein, and we're working, my organization, and we work in education and technology and working with the Mideast countries and North African countries, but in particular through a program that Woodrow Wilson had about 2.5 years ago or so. We had the opportunity to begin working with His Royal Highness El Hassan bin Talal, the younger brother of late King Hussein. And the point that he has made in most of his writings and what he does, comes back to this issue of religiosity as well as what's happening globally. And it relates to the point that you made about ideas and boundaries. He saw and believes that over a longer period of time, this was before the extreme reaction that we are getting in Iraq now and the killing and the massive. His point was that if you go back, as you described, you didn't have the church, the mosque, the imams involved with government in the Middle East and originally in the countries. And it has been largely a growth of the context of the church or religion into the government that has been a source of the problems. Lay aside oil for a moment. But more importantly, for the future, he believes that it is going, the extremeness of the jihadists is going to be minimized and play itself out over a period of time. And yet in our country, certainly Europe had its own issues of religion and government and what was happening. And in our country, I see a growth, a development to a greater level of piety, if you want to call it, or religion, that we ask candidates to go to church in the morning for the running for public office. And I see a growth away from what's happening around the world and an understanding of keeping religion and government separate, not to the extreme that we had. I'd like to get your reaction, and that has a lot to do with the boundaries of where they were. The question of ideas to them is from religion. And how do you see what's happening in the U.S. in relation to, if we look down to the future, of beginning more and more separation of the governments with the Middle Eastern countries, with the jihadists, and the way our country seems to be going?
Well, I just live here. I don't know a whole lot about the sociology of American religion, so it's difficult for me to comment on that.
Okay. Well,
That was one of those questions.
The
And
showstopper.
do you agree with me? I'd like to thank you all for coming today. Let me just alert you, I mentioned the November 2nd event, 4 to 6 with Jeff Goldberg, David Brooks, and Walter Wright. In this series, our next
He's the guy to ask, David Brooks.
Yeah, come come on Thursday if you're able to. On the next event in this series will be a meeting that we're co-sponsoring with the Asia program of the Wilson Center on the Strait of Malacca, and which is a key naval strait, central in discussions of energy, but also in the Southeast Asian context, there's a significant terrorism element. So we're working with the Asia program on that, and that meeting will be in the afternoon, 3:30 to 5:30 on Tuesday, November 14th. So mark that one down on the calendar and look out for the invitation. We've been treated to an excellent presentation today. We've had so many meetings on Jihad, the leaderless Jihad, trying to get into it. Today we had the durable Jihad, and all of in the subtext, or maybe it's the supertext of all these meetings, is how do we turn it off? And today we heard an excellent presentation on its durability. Sobering stuff for a Monday, but please join me in thanking Steve for an excellent presentation.
I may try to